So, I have a confession to make. I could never get into Final Fantasy XIV Online, and I'm not sure why that is. I mean, on paper, it should be the game for me. I love Final Fantasy games. I grew up with them. I played the original Final Fantasy on my Nintendo, as well as other fantastic JRPGs of the time, such as Dragon Warrior, or Dragon Quest as it's now called, and was instantly hooked. I remember as a kid taking Final Fantasy Adventure on my Game Boy on a camping trip with the family and being totally engrossed in it and beating it over a long weekend, when I probably should have been spending more time with the family. I still recall watching the trailer for the original Final Fantasy VII when it was announced to be coming out on the new Sony PlayStation console. The graphics for the time were unbelievable. I then poured in countless hours and late nights exploring every bit of the game. I was absolutely blown away by it. I also played Final Fantasy XI, the first Final Fantasy MMO, and loved that game too. Did I mention that I also happen to be a huge MMO enthusiast? I have played practically every MMO there is, starting way back with the original EverQuest, the MMO that popularized the genre. For me, there is just something special about the melding of the story, progression, and hero's journey of a great RPG, with the social aspects of a MMO, where you can make connections with people, play with friends, progress together, and share in each other's journey as you explore an RPG world together. Final Fantasy XIV was announced way back in 2009 and released in September of 2010, just after I graduated from pharmacy school. Life was crazy at the time and I wasn't able to get into the game right away, which in hindsight was a good thing, as although the game looked good visually, it seemed unfinished and sadly, it was severely flawed. Many people know the unlikely story by now, how the game was relaunched as Final Fantasy A Realm Reborn under the guidance of Yoshi P. And this time it was a success. I was excited to try it. I bought the game and downloaded it. I spent a good hour or so in the character creator, crafting the perfect avatar for my hero's journey. A tank class, of course, my favorite role to play in MMOs. The game looked absolutely incredible. My character looked incredible, and I was full of anticipation of the journey to come. I started picking up the quests around town and reading the dialogue, and doing all the little fetch quests, and reading more dialogue, and went off doing more fetch quests, and then more dialogue, and then had to run to the other end of the city, and then more text and dialogue, and then more dialogue, more fetch quests. Well, sometimes MMOs just start off slow. I just can't wait to get out in the world and try out the combat. Finally, a quest to go and do just that. The combat was slow to begin with, but this is typical in most MMOs, most progression-type fantasy games. Your character slowly gains power and new skills and abilities over time. Surely this would get better. About 20 levels in, and it was still just lots of clicking on quests, clicking through loads of dialogue, running very uninspiring fetch-type quests, and even worse, the combat was still painfully slow. I was sadly very disappointed. But it was okay. There are other MMOs around, other well-established MMOs on the market, and new MMOs launching all the time. I left Final Fantasy XIV the first time, somewhere around level 20. I did return a few times over the years, ready to give the MMO version of the IP that I had grown up to love another shot, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the issues were fixed and the game got better. But it always ended up the same way. Make a new character, level up to somewhere around level 20, become bored by the painstakingly slow combat, and quests filled with lots of clicking through dialogue and menial tasks, then log out and head off to the next MMO. Jump ahead to the end of 2023, and much has changed in my life. I have a house, a wife, and 2 beautiful kids. And in a really unexpected turn of events, I left my job and now do content creation full-time. My love for gaming had turned into a new full-time career. Also, over the time, I kept hearing of the success and accolades of various expansions for Final Fantasy XIV. I heard that it was even battling World of Warcraft for the most played MMO on the market. What was going on, and why was it that as an avid MMO lover and huge fan of Final Fantasy games, had I never been able to get into Final Fantasy XIV Online. Something must have changed. They must have implemented many overhauls to the combat and story quests over the years that I had missed. I decided to give it a shot again. Again excited to dive in head first to a living, breathing Final Fantasy world. I rolled with other players to interact with that shared my love for Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy had been on the market for over a decade. All those issues that had me turn away all those other times were surely remedied by now. I made my new character and jumped right in. The game looks absolutely incredible, much better than you'd expect for a game of its age, and there are players all over the place. I started grabbing all the quests, and running around doing all the tasks, and reading all the dialogue, and clicking on more quests, and reading through lots of more dialogue, and damn, I was starting to get bored all over again. I just want to go fight some mobs now. Nice. Finally a quest to go kill some stuff. Time to break up the monotony. Started fighting some cool looking monsters outside the city, but damn, the combat is still slow. Wait, is this really a 2.5 second global cooldown? I don't understand, has the game not improved at all? This has to get better with time. Maybe they fixed it down the road. Maybe it gets better with a few more levels under my belt. 20 levels in, and again it wasn't getting any better. Almost no voiceovers for the quests, and voiceovers are fairly typical for AAA MMOs nowadays. Lots of dialogue and clicking through quests and running all around completing seemingly menial tasks. And worse, the combat was still painfully slow-paced, especially compared to other MMOs on the market. Even at level 20, I only have a few attacks, and they are on a super long global cooldown. I was sadly very disappointed. Again. Then I had an epiphany. I recently played through Final Fantasy VII Remake, and was dabbling yet again with the OG Final Fantasy VII, one of my favorite games of all time. And then it hit me. Final Fantasy XIV Online is a Final Fantasy game. And I love Final Fantasy games. Why am I comparing it to other MMOs? Why am I being critical of its combat when Final Fantasy games typically have slower paced, turn-based combat? Combat that's more strategic, but great nonetheless. And I love those games. Final Fantasy games typically have a lot of text-based dialogue. Dialogue that introduces you to the world and the characters. Dialogue that turns into epic storytelling after it builds the world around you. And again, I love those games. I started to see it now. I was playing Final Fantasy XIV as an MMO. I was thinking about it as an MMO and comparing it to other MMOs, when I should have been thinking about it as a Final Fantasy game. Well then, how does it compare to other Final Fantasy games? Well, pretty good actually. I can see it now. I'm being introduced to the world and the characters. Sure, there are several fetch quests and running around, but it's showing me the world and I'm beginning to see the threads of a story starting to form. And I'm at the center of the story. It's my hero's journey, just starting to take off. Well, what about the combat? A lot of Final Fantasy games are typically slower paced, but the animations always look awesome and feel epic, with big vibrant spell and ability effects and over-the-top summon abilities. Even at lower levels, I'm starting to see that here. The combat animations look great, and they seem to be getting bigger and better with each new skill that I unlock. The monsters are also very unique and look fantastic, typical of a Final Fantasy game. I started to notice the music. Final Fantasy games are known for their absolute epic music tracks, and Final Fantasy XIV was no exception. The music is fabulous. I continued on, armed with this new perspective. I was used to comparing MMOs to each other, analyzing the combat and features. But I wasn't going to do that here. This game is different. It's a Final Fantasy game first and foremost. I started paying attention to the characters, the surroundings, the music and feel of the game, and I started to invest myself in the story. I started enjoying the game for what it is, a Final Fantasy game, a game that is a journey, a hero's journey, my hero's journey. Funny enough, not long after I took this new perspective, the game's MMO elements actually started getting better. Probably somewhere in the mid-level 30s, the game started feeling faster. I had new abilities now, more abilities, and some were not on the global cooldown. I now could weave different attacks in between my rotation, and had several different types of abilities for all types of situations. I had multiple single target attacks, and AoEs, and stuns, and interrupts, and shields, taunts, and range attacks. I also started unlocking more dungeons. Wow, the dungeons. The first two were decent, but they started getting bigger and better. The dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV are again different. Many of them have to be unlocked through quests, and there are an absolute ton of them. The dungeons are all very unique. They are themed differently, have different ecosystems and different music tracks that complement the look and feel of the environment. They also have a story to them and fit in and add to the lore of the game. And in typical Final Fantasy fashion, the main dungeon boss gets really played up with an epic cutscene and its own battle music. Maybe I'll change my mind down the road, but up until now, I refuse to skip the dungeon boss cutscenes. I just love getting pumped up for the final boss fight, even if it's the 20th time doing it. Sorry, team. I was also introduced to trials. These are 8-man, massive boss battles. They are fairly quick, only consistent of a single boss fight, but again have a big lead up with an epic cutscene and amazing boss music. The fights are fun and interesting, usually having multiple phases, and are a bit of a step up from the dungeon bosses, and are a nice change of pace in addition to the many dungeons. Around this time, the story also started to really come together. I was seeing the same NPCs, learning about them, their backstories, their struggles, learning of the mysterious events affecting and shaping the future of Eorzea, with a couple big surprises and intrigue along the way. Looking back, I could see that the earlier quests that seemed boring and irrelevant at the time were in fact laying the foundation of which my hero's journey was being built upon. It was setting the stage for the road ahead. I won't give any spoilers, but at the time of writing this, I had just finished the Realm Reborn main story quest line, and it was definitely worth the slow build-up. Also, we started getting some really nice voiced-over cutscenes finally.
By Ralga, you're alive. All of you.
It took a while for them to get sprinkled in, but they are very well done, and I definitely prefer them over my own attempts at voice acting. She lay down with a dragon, the gravest of all sins according to the Ishgardian faith. Oh! So here are my thoughts of the game, up to and through the main story quest line, A Realm Reborn. The game looks fantastic visually. It might not have the absolute most up-to-date graphics, but it definitely looks very good, particularly for a game of its age. The environments, character models, and monster design are all very much their own in a high fantasy style blended with anime. And the game is even getting a graphics update with the next expansion, which so far looks great. The early levels can seem tedious. There is a lot of dialogue and fetch quests, and almost no voiceovers even of the main story quest line, particularly early on. The combat does feel really slow for quite a while. So if you're coming directly from another MMO, particularly one with great combat right out the gate like Black Desert Online or Guild Wars 2, or a great voiced over story like The Elder Scrolls Online, this game can be somewhat of a shocker in the beginning. But I urge you, don't think of it like you think of other MMOs. Think of it as a Final Fantasy game. A game that takes its time to introduce you to the characters and build the world up around you before it sets you off on your epic journey. The features in the game, like dungeons, trials, and your chocobo mount, are slowly dripped in as you progress through the game. Final Fantasy XIV shares the strength of other Final Fantasy games. Epic storytelling and world building, fantastic battle animations and effects, amazing boss fights, and of course, the sensational music. When Yoshi P was asked, what is it that makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game, his answer was simple. Quote, you need to have the best story. You need to have the best graphics. You need to have the best battle system. You need to have a lot of content. You need to have chocobos. You need to have Moogles. You need to have great sound, and that makes Final Fantasy. End quote. And to me, that is what you get with Final Fantasy XIV. It is a Final Fantasy game through and through. It stays true to its roots. It stays true to its fans. It seems to not care what other MMOs are doing. It doesn't care what is typical MMO convention for the time. It delivers an experience, a truly Final Fantasy experience. And I see it now. And I now, too, am hooked. I'm Jarx26, and thank you for following us on this journey. I want to hear from you. What was your journey like when you started Final Fantasy XIV? If you'd like to continue to follow us while we continue our journey, feel free to stop by our Twitch channel and say hi to Divinity and I. Also, quickly, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters. I now do content creation full time, and you guys truly help keep the lights on. If you would like to help support me and continue to create videos, I'll leave a link below. Okay, guys, I'll see you in the next one.